Everybody has one. There's a whole internet subculture dedicated to it. Television idents and production captions that absolutely terrified you when you was a kid. For me, in the latter half of the 80s, it was Channel 4. Not so much because of the weirdly alien and inscrutable blocks flying through a void visual aesthetic, as for the music, which always sounded to me like Channel 4 was angry with me personally for doing something far too terrible to contemplate. Had I been born a bit earlier, it probably would have been Yorkshire.
Yorkshire television is the TV equivalent of Firestorm, the Nuclear Man, the superhero whose secret identity is actually two people. Yorkshire Television's secret identity was Telefusion Yorkshire, a rental firm, and Yorkshire Independent Television, who were considered by the ITA to be the two best bids for the newly created Yorkshire franchise in 1968. The Yorkshire franchise was created after Lord Hill, the head of the ITA, began to get slightly apprehensive about the domination of the same four companies, two of whom, ABC at the weekends and Granada at the weekdays, had been broadcasting in Yorkshire for the previous decade and indeed to most of the rest of the north of England, which was then one gigantic franchise, apart from the more incomprehensible parts to the east, which had had time since 1959. Anyway, Telefusion and Yorkshire Independent were respectively winner and runner-up in the Yorkshire franchise race, although that's only because the obvious frontrunner Ken Dodd with Diddy TV pulled out early. At least that's how it goes in my head. However, this being the ITA and not the ITC, it was decided that while television had an impressive amount of money, they didn't really have the broadcasting chops necessary to make the television worth watching. Yorkshire Independent, on the other hand, were skint, backed as they were by Yorkshire Post newspapers, trade unionists and the Co-op, but they had the better talent, and in a move that you would never ever in a million years see these days, it was decided that being rich was actually not enough. And so Telefusion and Independent were merged in a shotgun marriage, and took the typically plain-speaking name of Yorkshire Television. Yorkshire's initial ident, using then in vogue slit scan techniques, was as animated as it got for almost 20 years. The music famously references the Yorkshire folk tune On Ilkley Moor Bar Tat, in soft southern language, On Ilkley Moor without a hat. The premise being that if you do traverse said moor without said item of clothing, you will die, and everybody in Yorkshire will point and laugh at you for being a soft southern idiot. The pointy logo was known as a chevron, and nobody was quite certain what it was supposed to be, although the basic consensus is it's a stylised Y. More importantly, it didn't look like anything anyone else was using in their TV station logos. It was definitively Yorkshirean. The chevron itself went through a bit of evolution. Here's an only slightly distorted early version, as seen on production captions on schools programmes made by Yorkshire before they'd even started the franchise. Of course, some of our younger, less experienced viewers might be wondering what's so scary about that. Well, nothing, or not a lot. The music's a bit on the insistent side, but it's not Channel 4 level, and the animation is relatively subdued. More importantly, the animation is there. But of course, this being Yorkshire, it was decided that they were just too double-bastard hard to require an animated form-up for their channel's logo. And so began the legend of the terrifying Yorkshire ident. Imagine it. It's the 70s. You're a little kid living in Gipton or something. Trailer fades to black, and you tense up because you know what's going to come, and you know there won't be any warning. And it'll be any second now, and here it comes, and it's going to get you, and it's going to get you, and it's going to get you! And it wasn't just the poor people of Yorkshire who had to suffer this daily terror. Because in those days, up till the late 80s, programmes were introduced with little mini-idents for the companies responsible, making something as simple as watching Emmerdale Farm something of a test of nerve. This surly and uncompromising combination of still picture and frightening fanfare served as the ident for many, many further years, looming out of the darkness to terrorise successive generations of flat-capped youngsters. Outside of the presentation department, the show quickly established itself as one of ITV's major producers of network programming. As well as Emmerdale Farm, which came along in 1972, ITV produced Rising Damp, The Darling Buds of May, the first ever television vehicle for the great Les Dawson, and 321. Oh, also Puddle Lane, lunchtime preschool kidcast. A likeable slice of northern psychedelia that's notable for Neil Innes actually coming across as the tallest man in the room.
Up here. Yes, it does. Good.
And it wasn't all light entertainment. I mean, mostly, but not exclusively. One of the first major shareholders in Yorkshire, buying into it shortly after it was formed, was Alan Wicker, the unflappable documentarian, international playboy, and owner of the world's greatest moustache. He stayed with Yorkshire until going into semi-retirement in 1992, and provided the much-needed, serious, factual backbone to the channel. If that weren't enough, Yorkshire also excelled in the broadcasting of sports, being one of the first ITV companies to invest in outside broadcast equipment. Yes, all of a sudden, Yorkshire was a hive of culture and entertainment. Surprisingly enough, though, the 70s were also marked by constant disputes with the unions. Surprisingly, because Yorkshire Independent, the half of the merged company that had the talent but not the money, was originally backed by several cooperative societies and trade unions, none of whom, it seems, stuck around for very long. Strikes were, of course, hardly exclusive to Yorkshire television, especially not in the 70s, when it would have seemed, frankly, pretty strange if a day had gone by without yet another new union calling for industrial action. But Yorkshire is one of those regions full of working classes, and therefore not unfamiliar with the concept of the trade union. Discontent had been brewing in ITV for quite some time, ever since the 1968 shake-up in fact. The transition had not exactly been the smoothest in the whole world. Most notoriously, fellow New Boys LWT were transmitting for fully 2 minutes, and I'm being literal, before their first technical walkout. Eventually, the whole of ITV collapsed about its own ears for a bit, and in 1970, whippet-owning coal miners attempting to watch the news at 10 were instead greeted, reportedly, with this. Eventually, under the auspices of new union-busting chairman Sir Paul Fox, relative peace eventually broke out. Meanwhile, in 1974, after a series of very boring and stupid disputes over the Bilsdale transmitter, which happened to be dead centre between the Yorkshire and Tyne Tees regions, the two companies were effectively merged under the holding company Trident Television, which was almost a first for ITV, and certainly it was quite weird and even vaguely exotic to have another television company's name right underneath the name of the actual channel on the production captions. Trident wouldn't last, however. Barely 2 World Cups later, they'd been demerged by order of the freshly named IBA. I don't know what they did about the transmitter, maybe they painted a big red line down the middle of it or something.